morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the August Enterprise Risk Management Toolbox webinar. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you've dialed in by phone but haven't logged in by web and you'd like to see the slides that will be presented, please point your web browser to readytalk.com. In the box where it says Participant Join a Meeting, enter the same access code that you used for the call, 9879821. On the next screen, just enter your information and click the button to register and you will be placed in the webinar. Please stay aware of the level of background noise in your area, and if it becomes noisy, please put your phone on mute. If you don't have a mute button, you can use the ReadyTalk controls, which are *6 to mute and *7 to unmute. Similarly, if you're called away from your phone, please do not put your phone on hold because that will transmit your hold music to everybody else. You can simply hang up, dial back in when you're available again, and it will not disrupt the call. We are leaving the phone lines open, so if you have a question during the presentation, you can raise it directly. Also, I will be monitoring the chat box, so if you have a question, feel free to use that, and I will relay it to our presenter at an appropriate time. With that, let me hand the controls over to our presenter today, Hans Gude from UC Berkeley. Hans?
Thank you, Emily. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining. Let me go ahead and get started here. So today I'm going to be kind of reprising a presentation that I made in mid-June down at the UC Berkeley Risk Summit, or excuse me, UC System Risk Summit as part of ERM University. And let me start by saying I've seen a lot of presentations over the years about enterprise risk management, or ERM. And even to this day, I feel like most of these presentations are at a very high level, at a very introductory level. But at least the ones I've seen, they don't seem to show us how to get from theory to practice, from sort of conceptual principles to operational applications that yield data that leads to decision-making about risks. And so that's what we're trying to do here at Berkeley with ERM. And I think for the first time ever, at least to my knowledge, last fiscal year, UC Berkeley presented to management, as a result of the process that I'm going to describe today, a list of top risks that it believes senior management should focus on. And our most senior risk governance committee approved that list and actions going forward into this fiscal year to address those risks. And again, so it's that process that I want to talk about today. We have more work to do. We're sort of, I think about this sort of like hacking through a jungle. I mean, we're figuring out our path forward as we go along because we're learning new things. We're learning what works here at Berkeley, given our culture and our resources and so on. So it's a voyage of discovery, if you will. We have much work to do still, but I think we've come a long way, and I'm very excited about what we've done. I think it's pretty cool, and in some cases innovative, and so that's what we're going to share today. So let me start by talking about
97. I got it.
Ready talk.
Okay, let's talk about balloons for a minute. Here's a balloon. It's flying around up in the air. It's not attached to anything. It has no context. Let's call that a risk. What I find is that in a lot of discussions about risk, enterprise risk management, among my colleagues who are risk professionals, risks seem to be viewed as these things that sort of float around out there, that they're not really attached to anything. And if you could just do an inventory of all those risks that are kind of floating around out there, then you're going to have a really good, solid foundation, a good place to start. I was at a conference recently where the presenter just threw out at the audience, what are international risks? And people just started throwing stuff out there, but there wasn't a lot of context. And I think that's a problem. And so I take a different approach. Now imagine for a moment, here's a summer camp. If I had a friend who opened up a summer camp in the Sierra Nevada and said, hey, Hans, you're a risk guy, what risks should I be worried about? I just opened this summer camp, and I want to make sure, I'm protected. Well, the first question out of my mouth would be, what do you do? What activities do you do? Do you do canoeing, rock climbing? Do you do horseback riding, parachuting, cliff diving, hang gliding? And what do you do? What are your activities? Because as soon as you tell me that, then I'm in a position to start telling you what the risks are that you should be concerned about. And so a fundamental starting point for UC Berkeley's risk management approach, enterprise risk management approach, is that risks are tied to activities. They don't float around out there. They're tied to the things you do. And so activities can have risks that are simple. They can have risks that are extremely complex. This might illustrate, for example, a college campus or a nuclear power plant. Activities can have risks that are many but homogeneous, or many but heterogeneous. Risk can be small, risk can be large. You get the idea. So that's our starting point, is risks are tied to activities. So you can see where this is going. We have to ask, what are the activities we do here on campus? But let's now talk about enterprise risk management. It doesn't usually scroll, but it seems to have here. So that's ERM. Now, happy birthday, ERM. You're 10 years old this year. In 2004, COSO promulgated its enterprise risk management framework, which, of course, the University of California system has adopted and Berkeley has adopted, and of which I'm a huge fan, by the way. I think it's a really good framework. I think it gives us a real clear path forward, but it doesn't go deep enough. Okay, so ERM. My view is that, now I have a limited view of what's going on with ERM out there in the world. I think maybe the private sector is more effective. I don't know. But from my perspective, ERM looks like that thing that everybody's talking about, but very few are actually doing it. I mean, everybody's got the basic stuff kind of implemented, but that's not enough. But ERM seems to have taken on a life of its own. It's the thing you have to implement. Do you have ERM? And it's kind of taken on a life of its own as almost an end in itself. Well, ERM is a means to an end. But before I go on, I want to just say what it means for me. A lot of people don't like ERM. It's sort of jargony, and I kind of agree with that. But what I want to say is that when I talk about ERM, what I see as being pointed here is non-traditional, non-hazard, non-insurable risk. Now, ERM, we all know, encompasses that piece, but when I use the phrase, whatever we call it, the acronym ERM, I'm kind of alluding to all that other stuff out there: strategic risk, financial, operational, reputational. So for me, ERM is a handy phrase or acronym to kind of allude to all that other stuff. All right. So ERM is not a thing in itself. It's a means to an end. So I want to say, forget about ERM. ERM is simply a toolbox. It's a tool designed to solve a problem that all organizations face, regardless of what kind of organization you are. As soon as you open up your doors, this is Sproul Plaza at UC Berkeley, on what I might say is a non-typical day. But when you decide that you're going to open up shop, whatever your organization is, you're taking on some risk. And that's inevitable. That can't be helped. And I call that risk that you take on just by opening up your doors the ante rate. It's some level of risk that you've got to accept just to be in the game. So now you're open for business, and you have all these stakeholders, and they're interacting with your organization. So I want to say risk arises out of people doing specific activities, there's that word again, in specific settings with specific tools. And so an organization accepts this and addresses it based on risk appetite. Now, risk appetite's kind of a buzzword, it's kind of jargony, and I don't really want to get into it here, but it's an intuitive concept that we all understand. If you're walking across a rickety old bridge in Tanzania over a gorge, and you come across a guy selling bungee jumping opportunities, your internal risk appetite's going to kind of kick in and help you understand whether you're willing to accept that risk. Organizations have a risk appetite as well. Now, being higher education and not, say, an investment bank, it's very difficult to define what our risk appetite is, and that's a challenge we're faced with here at Berkeley, which we are still grappling with. But at this point, I just want to say we take on risks and we manage them according to our risk appetite. And then based on that, we make decisions, right? Are we going to accept, avoid, mitigate, or transfer those risks? And mitigation occurs through control activities. And control activities can be effective or not. I think here at Berkeley, we don't do a lot of, for some controls, certainly we do monitoring, but for a lot of controls, I think we rely on them quite a bit, but we're not absolutely certain they're working effectively. And there's two ways that control can fail, right? I mean, it can fail because it was never designed correctly in the first place. So even if it's being operated perfectly, if you put the lock on your side gate of your house on the wrong side of the gate where the hinges are, well, you know, it doesn't matter if everybody uses that lock perfectly. It's actually not designed correctly, and it's not going to work. So you can fail in the design of a control, but even if the control is designed perfectly, it can fail because somebody's not doing it properly. It's not being operated effectively. And so that's two ways controls can fail. And the more risky your activity is, the higher the potential bad stuff that could happen, the more important it is to know that your controls are actually working. Okay, so that's kind of a little background. So we risk managers, we are like, you know, gods on Olympus looking down at our organizations. And we're looking at our organizations, and we're confronted by a question. Here's Berkeley. There's UC Berkeley. Aerial view of the campus. And so as we look down at our organizations, you know, we ask ourselves, what should I be worried about? And so Berkeley, we have all kinds of things to be concerned about. We have Memorial Stadium back there, which sits right on the Hayward earthquake fault. Earthquakes very much in the news this week. We have California Hall, which is where the chancellor and the senior executives for the campus have their offices. That's where they determine campus strategy. We have strategic risks. We have dormitories. We have student housing where students are engaged in all kinds of activities. They have a very high risk appetite, students tend to. We do research. We have aging infrastructure. We have relationships with the city and the state and so on. We have all kinds of risk activities. Now, most risk activities, of course, are managed at the local managerial organizational level, and they're quite effectively managed at that level. But we have controls that are in place. We have all kinds of people exercising the controls. We're not sure how effective they are necessarily. We're not sure what the inherent risk is of an activity, and so we ask this question, what should I be worried about? And we have limited resources to address those issues. And so I want to posit this statement: risk management is a resource allocation problem. We have limited resources, which of course are people, time, and money. And we have to make decisions about where to implement those resources. So this is the question in my mind, this is my perspective of what the problem that every organization faces and that every organization must understand, and that ERM is the tool to help answer this question. And in my view, if you have not answered this question, or if you're not moving in the direction of answering this question, then you're not doing ERM. And when I said earlier that we got to a point where, for the first time, we have identified a set of top risks, proposed those for focus by management, and management has agreed, effectively, let me show you what that looks like. So organizationally, here's a stack of colored bars. Let's say that is a key organizational unit on our campus. In this case, it's the one that's called the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost. And if those bars, those colored bars, represent risks, and moreover that those are the risks that are stacked from lowest concern to highest concern, or highest risk, or highest inherent risk, however you want to define that, that would be a great start. And those are probably being managed at the organizational level by the Vice Chancellor and all of the people in that control unit. So let's say we now have that information for all of our 7 control units. And if these risks have been identified and assessed, then and organized and ranked lowest to highest, then we can say, okay, let's take the top risks off of each of these, and I would like to say that the ones I care about are the ones that have the potential to impact not just your control unit, but the whole campus. And so I would say, great, let's identify those and let's pull those forward. And let's make those visible at a higher campus level, at an enterprise level, in our case at Berkeley, it's the CERT Committee, Compliance and Enterprise Risk Committee, and we make that visible. And moreover, I would say, now of these, let's say, what are the biggest ones, and let's elevate those to the highest level, to some executive body. In this case, it's what we call the Care Committee, because those are the ones, Chancellor, Vice Chancellors, those are the ones that could conceivably keep our organization from achieving its principal missions of teaching and research and public service. These are the risks you should be concerned about at your level. So conceptually, that's my view of what effective enterprise risk management will accomplish, and it's what we have taken a start at here at Berkeley of doing. And ERM, the COSO model, of course, is scalable, right? You got the little cube, and on one side of the cube it shows departmental, it shows department, it shows campus, it shows system. I mean, applying that to our organization, enterprise risk management ought to be able to scale from a department all the way to University of California Office of the President. And at any level within there, you can say, what should we be concerned about, to the point where you can say, what should the president of the system be worried about? So conceptually, that's the goal in my view. Well, exactly. How do you do that? Well, there is a playbook, and I apologize to the Niners fans on the call. I did not. This is their arch enemy, the Seattle Seahawks, and I did not find a good playbook picture of the Niners, so went with this one. So we do have a playbook for how do you do that, and it is called COSO, COSO ERM. And so there's a bunch of our colleagues. We're all sitting around, applying COSO. But see, in my view, COSO's, it's great, but it's very high level, and every organization's a little different, and you've got to figure out how to ground it down in your organization to the point where it's operational and you can get good data for making decisions about where to apply scarce resources. Okay, so at this point, I'm ready now to kind of go into how we solve this at Berkeley. So naturally, we start with a formula. The solution, in my mind, and the approach I took, starts at a high level and it goes very deep. And so the high level is, well, fundamentally, what is the formula for getting at the information you're looking for, namely, where should I apply my scarce resources? What risks should I be worried about? And you start with a very high-level conceptual formula, kind of at this level. And so what I came up with is this formula. So there's that word activities again. Some set of activities which have variables A, B, and C, that set of activities will yield the activities I should be most focused on for applying my resources. And so what are these variables? The variable A, activities that are mission critical. COSO, of course, is about risk. COSO defined risk as threatening objectives. So your objectives are your high-level mission things. For Berkeley, for the University of California, it's teaching, research, public service. So that's what I mean by mission critical. They're the activities that really hit those things. B, the activity can potentially result in high-impact risk events. In other words, if something goes bad in carrying out this activity, the impact is very high on a scale. And C, and this is very important, the risks inherent in the activity are potentially under controlled. I think a lot of the top risk lists I've seen in the past have been, what are your top risks? And you say, oh, well, it's that we won't get accredited. You go, oh, yeah, if we don't get accredited, that's bad. And in fact, in my method here, accreditation comes up as almost the highest risk because it threatens what Berkeley is. But guess what? That is a highly, highly controlled risk. And so its residual risk drops way down. So what we're interested in is what are the potentially high impact activities that may be under controlled? Because that's where we're vulnerable, and that's what we need to know about.
Hans, we have a question in the chat box.
Yes.
And that is, why must the activity be mission critical? What if B and C are true but not A?
Okay, that's a great question. Again, it's about scarce resource application. And when we look at our activities, and you'll see this a couple slides down, when we look at our activities that we list out and we're now thinking about from the perspective of risks, we realize that they're not all the same. I don't care about all these activities as much as others. And so I start to point out things about each activity, things like, is it mission critical? Because what that's going to do is the mission critical activities cannot be allowed to fail. And so I want to focus on those when I start applying risk resources. Now, recall my comment earlier that risks are largely managed by middle managers all through the organization. And so it's very likely that those risks are being controlled at that level quite well. It's the risks. This exercise is about elevating risks to senior executive vision perspective so they can see these. So that's why mission critical. Okay, so that's our formula. Mission critical, potentially high impact, and potentially under controlled. So we have to start with a method. Okay, I have my formula. Now I need to know how to sort of implement it. And so the method can be viewed as a kind of a map. Now this is a map of a place that's very dear to baby boomers. This is the land of Oz and the Emerald City right there in the middle. And what the method does is it gives you a set of steps or work activities. And if you walk through those steps, and if your method is correct, you will get to your destination. Now, and I'm going to tell you my method in a minute. Now, you also need, in addition to a method, you also need some tools. And the tools are sort of the usual suspects. You need an Excel spreadsheet, because that's where you're going to map out the results of the information you gather. You also need scales. And the scales that we used, these will look familiar, impact, likelihood, and we also used control effectiveness. And the scales are important because when you're talking to an organization about strategic risks or operational risks or life safety risks or financial risks, you need a scale that allows you to compare apples to apples. Because you've got all these risks out there, and you're saying, now I'm going to tell you, senior management, what you should focus on. And I've analyzed them all using a common scale so that they can be absolutely compared. But there's a constraint we have in higher education. Now, again, if we were an investment bank, then our scale could be very quantitative, very numerical. But of course, there's two ways to analyze data. There's quantitative and qualitative. In our organization, in higher education, we can't really be so quantitative. Perhaps in some parts of the organization we can, in budgeting and finance. But overall, we have to take a kind of a qualitative approach. Is it a high risk? Is it a low risk? And so on. And in this way, we rely on, as we did here at Berkeley, subject matter experts, or SMEs. We talk to the people who we think know the answer, and we get their opinion. If you've taken some business classes, you may recognize these 4 types of data: nominal, ordinal, interval, ratio. And as you go from top to bottom, you can be more quantitative in your analysis of the data, but we're really stuck up here: qualitative, subjective. And it sort of looks like this. These are our activities or risks, and during this conversation I may use those 2 words kind of interchangeably. Let's say these are our risks. And as I look at these, I start to realize, okay, well, let's see. We have red books, green books, books about art, science, and so on. And you just start kind of moving them into different piles. And finally, you get to where you have something that looks like this. This is analogous to what we did here at Berkeley. I can't absolutely compare, say, this book to this book to this book using quantitative measures, but I can push them up into different little cubby holes based on my scales that I developed and certain criteria. Okay, so that sort of gives you a sense of the method we take. Now here of the approach to sort of organizing or analyzing and sorting the data. So now let me talk more about the data, or excuse me, the method or the map. So I asked 6 questions. And the 6 questions are effectively our map, our steps through the process. And if we go through these 6 questions, then we'll get to where we want to go. We'll get to the magical land of Oz, where to apply limited risk mitigation resources. At this point, I'm going to go through these one at a time to say what they are, and then I'm going to go back to each one, and I'm going to say how we answered that question at Berkeley. Okay, so the first question, and we have to do these in this order. What are the principal activities UC Berkeley undertakes? What is the relative importance of each activity to achieving the mission? What is the nature of the risks inherent in each of the identified activities? How severe could a risk event be? And then 5, given the potential risks, how effective is the current control environment at reducing those risks to an acceptable level? Acceptable level alludes to some sense of our risk appetite. And then finally, given all of that, given the risks and severities and the control effectiveness, how likely is it that we'll still experience a risk event under this activity? All right, so let's look at these one at a time, and now I'm going to show you how Berkeley answered these questions. What are the principal activities UC Berkeley takes? Well, we do thousands of things. We fill up beakers in laboratories. We give inoculations in our health clinic. we give classes, we repair buildings, we do thousands and thousands of things. We needed to come up with a list that was manageable. And so I went out into the world, into the internet world, and also the UC, University of California, and I found all kinds of sort of taxonomies of how to organize things we do. And working with our risk subcommittee, we finally came up with 12 functional categories, and here they are. And for each functional category, we came up with, let's take information technology as an example, we came up with anywhere from 6 to 12 principal activities. And each principal activity begins with a verb, or ideally it does, because it's an activity. It's something we do. It's not a risk. It contains risk inherently in it, and that's the point of this exercise, is to sort of tease out those risks. So we start with, what do we do? And that resulted in, this is not intended to be readable, but this is just gives you an overview that we came up with for our 12 functional categories. We came up with about 100 activities. And that felt pretty manageable. Okay, so that was the answer to question 1. That was our starting point. These are the activities we're going to work with. And by the way, we didn't think this was the perfect list, the end-all, be-all list, but we felt it's a very good start and that it can evolve as we go forward. All right, the next question, what is the relative importance of each activity to achieving the mission? All right. So if you look at all the things we do across all those 100 activities, all those activities sort of, you can think about them like these stacked blocks. This game actually has a name. I don't know what it is, but and if you pull one out, does the organization still stand? And as I looked at all the activities, I thought to myself, I don't care as much about all these activities as others from a risk management perspective. They're not all equal. It occurred to me, there are some things we do that as I'm assessing an activity, as I'm thinking about the risks around an activity, there are some things that I want to be more mindful of as I think about them. And so I assigned some symbols to things. And here you see the kind of symbols that we assign to each activity. And what are the symbols? What are the special designations that we came up with? And so here they are. I came up with 3 essential activities essential to Berkeley's ability to achieve its mission. Core value driver, that's a solid diamond. What Berkeley has or does that attracts the best and the brightest faculty and students and leads to its high rankings. Now, if you're going to do core value drivers, there must be things that, if I don't do this, I can't do the core value driver. So there must be things that enable that. And I called those core value enablers. These are the people, processes, or technology essential to achieving and delivering the value drivers. And finally, given the world we live in now in higher education with so much change going on, I came up with what I called a game changer. These are the activities that are critical to competitive parity or advantage vis-a-vis our peer institutions. So things like online education, global engagement, these are game changers. Okay, so in addition, as we looked at this list, it occurred to me, there's some activities we do on this list that if things go south, if we have a risk event, that can cost us a lot of money or it can shut the campus down. And so we came up with these things we call an Achilles heel, which is a failure or worst case, Achilles heel. A failure or worst case scenario under this activity could shut down the campus's ability to deliver research, teaching, or public service. Achilles heels are things like internet technology, the servers being up. It's the energy delivery to the campus to enable scientific experiments. And we also came up with what we call bank breakers. A risk event under this activity could result in a significant increase in costs or a decrease in revenue. So assigning all these things started to look like this. You see the symbols. So as we analyze these activities, we're mindful of how important they are or how risky they are, given that we've assigned these variables. Okay, so we did that. Now, what is the nature of the risks inherent in each of the identified activities? So you're going to recognize these things. These are risks, or activities can have different kind of risks. So, for example, if you do animal research, you could have, or let's say if you do human research, human-based research using human subjects, well, you could have a health safety risk where a person is injured, but you could also have a reputational risk or a strategic risk or a compliance risk. You have different kinds of ways, the categories where things can go wrong, and we call these the risk categories. And there's a lot of those. COSO, for example, has its famous four. Strategic, compliance, reputation, and reporting. Not a fan of reporting. But anyway, here's what we came up with at Berkeley. Financial, an increase in cost or a decrease in revenue. Health, life, safety, physical or emotional injuries or fatalities. Operational, that's shutting the campus down. That's not being able to carry out a key activity effectively or efficiently. Reputation, a violation of the social contract with stakeholders, leading them to behave in an adversarial way. Notice it doesn't say anything about getting our names in the newspaper here. That's not very helpful. I like this definition. I don't have time to say more about it, but I learned about it at a RIMS conference in San Francisco. I wish I could remember the name of the author. He's actually a doctor, former coroner from Los Angeles. Anyway, reputation risk and strategic risk, the failure to achieve a strategic objective. Oh yes, what about compliance? Well, you know what we found out is as I started talking, I originally had compliance at this level, but as we started talking to each of the subject matter experts, what we found is that we could put a check in a box that said compliance. Oh yes, you could have a compliance risk. But then when I said, well, how bad could it be? What we found was that we always went to financial. It had a financial impact. We're going to be fined or we're going to lose federal grants. Or it had a reputation risk because we failed to comply with human subject requirements or something. So we took it off of there and thought of these more as consequences as opposed to pure impacts. The consequences are the answer to the question, so I have a risk, and here's the impact, and you look at the impact and you say, well, so what? And then you say, oh, well, you could lose federal grants, or you'll have a reputation risk and your donors will stop giving you money. Those are the consequences of your risk impacts, and that's what we're measuring here. And so the next question in our method, walking through the map to get to our destination, how severe could each of these risk events be? And so this is where we use our scales. Here is a impact scale. Now notice that here are the categories of risk that we just talked about. And here are the scales 1 through 4, minor to severe. And so we populated those with information, examples of what that intersection looks like, so that when we talk to the SMEs, they can find a home for the risk. And we also talked about, and I got this from Zurich, not what's the worst thing that could happen, but under the most credible scenario, where could we land? Where would it land? Okay, so we had our scale, and that yielded now something that looked like this. Now, jumping ahead, I'm filling out an Excel spreadsheet here. I've populated an Excel spreadsheet with my map questions, and now I'm putting the answers in here. And so in this case, we not only said it was this activity could have a financial impact, but the consequence under a most credible scenario is a 4. Reputation does not apply in this case, and so on. Okay, question 5. Given the potential risks, how effective is the current control environment? Now again, we have a scale. And let me pause for a moment and say about scales. I've struggled quite a bit with scales. Do I want a 1 through 5 scale? Do I want a 1 through 3 scale? Zurich uses a 10-point scale. And I'm not sure I've landed on a completely satisfactory place with scales. But what occurs to me is you just got to plant a stake in the sand and say, you know what, this works. This is good enough. We're going to go with this, and just go with it. Because you want consistent results across all these categories of risk. Now, if we're going to have the scalability in ERM from our chemistry department at Berkeley up to University of California Office of the President and looking at the whole system, we're going to need a common scale. So these are issues that need to be solved and agreed on. But for this exercise, we landed on a 4-point scale. All right, so I asked my SMEs, so across those risk areas that you've just identified and the levels of risk, how good are we at controlling these risks? And then finally, given the potential risks and severities and the effectiveness of controls, how likely, this is me asking the SME a question, how likely is it that we'll still experience a risk event under the activity? And once again, we have a scale. And they picked somewhere. And let me say at this point, nobody said 1. Basically, sorry, I jumped to an explanation of something I want to say about the control effectiveness scale. Nobody said they had little or no control over the risk areas, and that's good, right? A few people said 4s, and we had a lot of 2s and 3s. And so what I became interested in our analysis at the end is the minimal. If you said controls are minimal, that's where I was saying, okay, you're under control. There's more we can do. But I did have to take their word for it, that if they said it was well controlled at a 4, then it's well controlled. Okay, so let's get back to where we were. So we had the likelihood scale. Now here you see how I mapped out the data using an Excel spreadsheet. Here I populated my questions. Here are the numbers for the categories, and so on. And my Excel spreadsheet looked like this. So let's take a moment and think about what we've accomplished. I had about 40 interviews with subject matter experts. We did not get to all 100 rows. We got to about 82 rows. And what you see here is, here are the functional categories. Here are the principal activities. Here's the campus functional owner. Here's the SME whom I consulted. And then here's where I started to populate the information. Over here, in this grayed out area, that's where I built in all my decision rules about how I'm now going to, well, let me back up. So what I have here, if I had completed all 100 rows, I have solid data. Then effectively what I'm saying is this Excel spreadsheet gives you an overall comprehensive snapshot of the UC Berkeley campus's risk profile. And so now I'm down in the weeds. I'm at the single cell level, Excel cell level, entering data. Now I got to step back and ask myself, what does this mean? What can I determine? What do I know? What does this tell me? And so I had to come up with some decision rules. And the decision rules tie back to that high-level formula that we had, which was, okay, I want to pull out those activities that are critical to the mission, which, if I can, there's my arrow, which have these little symbols next to them. I want to pull out my activities that are critical to the mission, that are potentially high impact, So the ones that over here have 3s and 4s, and the ones that are potentially under control. So I have to come up with decision rules in my Excel spreadsheet to sort of find those things for me. And the way I did that was I said, okay, here's what I care about. These are the higher priority activities. These are the activities we're going to pull off the top and recommend to senior management that these are the ones that need attention. So the ones that have the activities that have 3s and 4s in the risk categories, those are the high potential impacts, that they have essential factors tied to them, that they have risk accelerators. So if a bad thing happens in this activity, we're going to have a huge impact, that have limited control effectiveness, bold underscore, and then a high likelihood of having a risk event. The SME might have said, oh yeah, we have great controls, but guess what? We're still going to have risk events in this area. And so over here on the far right of my Excel spreadsheet, I have a column called Recommended Level of Focus for Applying Risk Mitigation Resources. And that's the result of my decision rules. And I came up with these 6 things. This activity is a priority for risk resources. It needs attention. Let's check it out. It's probably okay. It's definitely okay. Or let's accept it because the risk is really so low. And so here's what my sorted results look like from a strictly inherent risk perspective. Here's my weighted risk severity if controls fail. So here's the usual suspect: maintain campus seismic adequacy, achieve academic accreditation, assess and admit top quality students, and so on. But notice the control status: adequately controlled, strongly controlled, adequately controlled, unlikely will have a risk event, very unlikely will have a risk event. So this sort is not that useful to me. Parenthetical: it's very useful when we decide we're going to go out and monitor the controls up against these very high inherent risk activities. We want to make sure that these activities are well controlled as the SMEs claim them to be, because the repercussions are very serious. So what we're interested in is the priority sort. And the priorities I just explained a moment ago. So relatively high inherent risk, potentially under controlled, very likely to have a risk event. So these are priorities. And then it goes to attention and so on down the line. So remember, we just push stuff around. This is not absolute comparison of things like you can do in a scientific method situation. We basically organized activities, organized risks, asked people what cubby they should go in, and then we basically said, okay, these are the ones we're going to care about. Now from, a heat map. You can't do an ERM presentation without a heat map, right? Okay, so what do we have here? What I took was my Excel spreadsheet results and I mapped it. So here you have weighted inherent risk severity from low to very high. There's achieve academic accreditation. But over here you have control effectiveness. So it's nearly complete to little or none. We had no activities that were little or none controlled. But we basically said priority items are the ones that are right in here. And so you can draw a line and call that your risk appetite threshold. I've inferred or deduced, or whatever the right word is, that that's our risk appetite threshold by virtue of having selected these activities and then finding where that line is. And so that's our risk appetite threshold. So I see we have about 8 minutes left. Okay, so we did this exercise. We came up with these recommended levels of focus. And what's next? We have to recommend to management. We have to pull something out of this exercise and recommend it to management. So what we did was we said, okay, let's take the top two. Let's take the priority ones and the attention ones, That turns out to be 14 activities. And let's recommend that to senior management that those are the activities containing inherent risk, potential risk events that require focus next fiscal year, meaning the year we're in now. So put this aside for a moment. The next step was, okay, we're going to recommend that management focus on these things, but we need to go a step further. We need to recommend what management actually do about these things. We don't want them to solve it. We want to suggest a solution. So we came up with what we called risk dispositions. And so here you see them. Stay the course. So what this means is there's already a lot of attention being focused on this. For example, laboratory safety throughout the UC system is already, there's a lot of activity being focused on that. So if that came up on our priorities, we're saying, for this one, stay the course. We also have a refer to management where express CERC's concerns. CERC is at Senior Governance Risk Committee. Express CERC's concern to management and ask management to evaluate the risk, take the action it feels is appropriate, and report back. 2015 initiative. Maybe there's not a lot of consolidated effort being put on a risk, so we're saying more focus is warranted, therefore define and execute a project, and so on. So we came up with these. And let me advance the slide here. There we go. And we produced a report which we presented, and I don't have to actually do that because in my next slide I circle that. It was approved by CARE. CARE is the Senior Campus Risk Leadership Group. We presented this and they approved it. So that our recommended dispositions are their recommended disposition. This is no longer our opinion, risk management. This is now the official position of the UC Berkeley campus. And let me see. So at this point, so that basically concludes the presentation and our process. So a couple of follow-up things. This year, right now, we are now taking the data, that detailed spreadsheet, and we're breaking out the various control units, and we're saying we're going to talk today in our risk subcommittee about how to present it, but we're basically going to parse out the data for each control unit and give them that information, and hopefully that's going to be a hook into the Vice Chancellor level to get a whole new level of engagement. Because the Vice Chancellor may look at this results and say, you know, that doesn't look right. Let's talk about this. Or may say, that looks absolutely dead on. Let's talk about this. So we're doing this exercise now where we're parsing it out and want to have a conversation. And we can do things like this for comparing campus-wide risk severity under strategic, financial, and so on, campus-wide against student affairs. So if you take all of, for strategic, if you took all of the 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s that were assigned by subject matter experts under strategy for all those 100 activities, and you take an average to see where the severity does it float toward the top 4s or toward the bottom, well, for the campus, it's 2.7 overall, but student affairs actually carries higher strategic risk than the campus as a whole. And we can do these kinds of analyses because we have actual data now. And this year we want to tighten up that data, but we think we've got an excellent start here, and certainly an excellent start for carrying forward this calendar year. And so let's see. This is my penultimate slide. After I did this risk assessment, and I think about this stuff, I'm actually a philosophy major, so the word cosmology is a branch of metaphysics, and it means the study of the fundamental structure, nature, and dynamics of the universe. So I borrowed the word cosmology, not from science and physics and astronomy, but from philosophy to say I'm interested in the fundamental structure, nature, and dynamics of risk. And so this is my latest thinking in what the various elements are. We've focused on activities, but you also have all the stakeholders. You have the background setting of the economy, demographics, weather, political, legal. You have the tools. Is somebody up in a tree with a chainsaw in the Amazon jungle? It's a very different risk profile than sitting in an office with a pencil and a computer. There's the physical setting and so on. So this is sort of the next thinking and how to incorporate all of these into our results and how that affects them. So at this point, with just a couple of minutes left over, as a good baby boomer, I want to say that's all, folks.
All right. We do have 5 minutes, so if there are questions, feel free to ask them. And if not, if any questions come to mind afterwards, you can reach us. Feel free to email me. My email is on the invitation, and I will be happy to relay any messages to Hans. Thank you very much for joining us for the August Toolbox webinar, and we hope to see you for future webinars.